Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ashley Ott. I've been a academic support, working in academic support center at AU for about 6 years, and I work with many students as a writing specialist. So I'm excited to be here. I am looking forward to working with you on thinking more carefully about what it means to analyze and synthesize in your papers. And so in this short presentation, what I hope to do in the next 20 to 25 minutes is to both establish what exactly these terms mean, but then how we can apply them to the various projects that we're going to be working on. Maybe you're currently working on or have worked on in the past. The two things I want us to really consider and hold with us throughout this presentation are these two questions because they really correspond to the two principles that we're discussing. How does it work? How does the text you're reading work? How does the research you're doing work? How does that video you're watching work? The second question is, why does it work the way it does? And these questions correspond with analysis and synthesis. So when I say, how does it work? I'm asking us to analyze. And when I say, why does it work the way it does? I'm asking you to synthesize. And it's as easy as that. Thinking about how we can break something down into its constituent parts, followed by how can we take those parts and put them together into something new. Analysis and synthesis are higher level skills of thinking. They're asking students to do more than summarize, than making observations, but to put those observations together into something new. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to share with you a few visualizations of how others have imagined the way analysis might look, just to help us sort of think through and conceive of it in various ways. So here's an image of analysis from medium.com, and you'll see on the left, analysis was envisioned as kind of breaking something down into constituent parts. Again, how does it work? We can think of that if we're examining a car, for example. How do the parts come together? And what is it broken down into? Synthesis is combining those separate elements in order to understand how it works. So the default way we learn today is by analysis, and we do this all the time. It just means taking something and breaking it down into its parts, then studying the parts to understand the whole better. So if you're in chemistry, if we learn about water, we break it down into its pieces, like hydrogen and oxygen, if you're in science. Or to learn about how a car works, we look at its individual pieces to better understand the whole car. So analysis is the default way of figuring out how things work today. How does it work? Again, we're coming back to that same question. I know you're going to get tired of me saying it by the end of this presentation. And so this works across disciplines. It's not specific to papers. And to go along with that is we break things down to understand it better. But the other side is the synthesizing, which is thinking about why the system works the way it does. So if we wanted to sort of extend that metaphor of like thinking about a car and breaking it down into the way it works. And so kind of understanding how those parts are working together is really essential. The synthesis part, though, is asking why does it work the way it does? And so there was Edward Deming says a system cannot explain itself. If you want to understand the why behind a question, you need synthesis. And so we're going to think about the ways in which analysis and synthesis are the same parts. They're sort of important parts, importantly related parts. And so I have an example for you. I wanted us to just jump right in and just do a tiny bit of practice analysis. And what we do in this short exercise is something that you can carry with you into any of the kinds of projects you'll be doing in any of your classes. It's applicable across courses. So I have a picture here that I wanted to show you. It's a painting from the 16th century. It's by Peter Bruegel the Elder. And he was a Flemish painter, and this particular painting is called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. And so I wanted us to just practice. So whether we're looking at a car, whether we're looking at a mathematical formula, whether we're looking at a painting, what are some of the steps that we might take that are similar, but different for depending upon the particular genre we're looking at? What are the same kinds of steps that we can practice to sort of interiorize that particular rhetorical and academic skill? All I want you to do is answer the question, what do you notice? I don't want you to try to figure out what's happening in the picture. I don't want you to have to do the second question, which is, why does it work the way it does? I just want us to simply ask the question, what do you notice? anything that you can see immediately striking to your eyes, anything that you can look sort of more carefully into the picture, but also things that just stand out right away. First, the bright red that's unique in the rest of the painting. Thank you. Yes, so absolutely. The red is the only sort of unique color to this image. And the painting becomes less detailed farther. Absolutely. So we have in the foreground something that's very descriptive, and then it sort of fades as the horizon does. I think this painting is really fun because it rewards like just spending a couple minutes looking at it. This Fall of Icarus is actually pulling and drawing from a previous story written by Ovid a long time ago, the mythology of Icarus and his son, Daedalus and his son Icarus, who are escaping an island, and Icarus flies too close to the sun. His wings are made of wax. And so this image right here is capturing the moment that seems to have Icarus falling from the sky. And so we see thank you for your observations. Some sort of glacier ice geography in the back. Absolutely. Some sun setting here. We see someone drowning over in this corner. Right in the center, though, we're looking at this peasant. We're looking at this farmer who seems to be walking with his horse. And so right here, we're talking about, that's absolutely right, thinking beyond summary and trying to make some kind of a claim. First, analyzing to kind of notice things, make observations, understanding how it works. And that's exactly what's happening here. We think the peasant maybe is the one that's centered. He's wearing the red, but everyone seems to be looking away. The farmer's looking away, the shepherd's looking away. For those of us who are maybe just wanting to think of a certain process for analyzing, thinking about sort of visual succinct steps, hopefully this will be helpful to kind of get you to that synthesis. So you had mentioned the red here. Do we see red anywhere else in this painting? Now that we've sort of noticed the ways in which people are looking away, things are moving away. The sun's going down, the boat is moving away. If you look to the bottom right lower corner, you'll see that there's a man down there who also has red on his head. So when we're thinking about analysis, we're trying to understand those subtleties. In other words, moving beyond summary by just saying, what do we see in this picture? What's happening? But what are the patterns that sort of inform observations? So now that we've made a lot of observations, I have a sort of very sort of succinct process that I'd like to share with you. It's an analytical tools for observation and interpretation. It's a set of steps that anyone can take in any field to work from moving an analysis to synthesis, or coming to kind of an argument, putting it all together. And so what we've done first is noticed. What did you notice? Getting past generalizations, thinking about the particulars, right? Looking for patterns, repetitions, and contrasts. We saw repeated reds. We noticed that there was a particular way that everyone was featured and focused, which was towards the west, right? Looking away. And so we came up with a set of details. Here are some very specific kinds of details. You could find details with words, strands or groupings of the same similar kinds of words. That's more for maybe a textual analysis. List contrasts. We talked about the different coloration. So you'll have to have a little bit of a different toolbox depending on what field you're coming from, whether you're talking about film, whether you're talking about text, whether you're talking about sciences. And so that will kind of depend upon the genre. But what we've done then is we've come up with those analysis points, and we're coming to some kind of a conclusion. And we do those observations so we can come to some kind of an informed argument. And so we might say, this painting seems to be about a farmer working in his sort of rudimentary and sort of everyday life, right? But here it really is about the ways in which people are maybe ignoring something that is happening that could be important. It looks like someone's drowning, but no one seems to be paying attention. And so no one seems to care. And so that's the important feature, is that we're seeing a text, but we're re-seeing it for our audiences, and we're showing them how we see something differently. And that translates across genres, across disciplines. And this is really important, but it does take time and it does take care. It seems like this first exercise was generative, just as an example of how we might approach analyzing and then taking our observations and synthesizing them and explaining why it works the way it does. Why is the painting working the way it does? For anyone who's interested, William Carlos Williams and James Auden both wrote poems about this painting, and they do just that. They take a whole spin on this painting, explaining how that, thinking about that sort of philosophical idea of, the bystander effect. In the final part of the presentation, I'm just going to go through some very brief and various definitions of like what is analysis and synthesis and how it can apply. I have some tools for you to take along with you, and just a few other discipline-specific ways to make observations, make analysis, and then to synthesize that, to put it all together. So just briefly, I came across some really kind of various definitions, but I really like this one about thinking about pulling on the thread. So thinking about like if you're this metaphor of like sewing and then pulling the thread and it all starts to unwind. And so thinking about analysis in a different way, other than sort of thinking about it as kind of parts sort of broken apart, you can also think about pulling a thread, unraveling something. The process of breaking a concept down into more simple parts, or as David Lodge says, the way of unraveling itself. The longer you pull the thread, the more flaws you find. It doesn't necessarily have to be flaws, but that's what David Lodge is writing in his novel. So that's the analysis. How does it work? But then the synthesis is even more important. Why does it work the way it does? So making some kinds of grand gestures at understanding what's happening, translating ideas into actions. Or as Stanley Rosen says, see analysis is not to analyze, it's rather to see an articulated structure as a unity, whole, or synthesis. So stepping back and looking at your observations and telling us what you see. Two very sort of different ideas. Here's another, I'm happy to share with you different kinds of visual conceptions of what this sort of theoretical trait looks like. So we can think of analysis as taking a bigger whole on the left there and breaking it down into something small on the right. But then synthesis is then looking back at that whole and telling us how we've seen something anew. Really important strategies, really important concepts to master at the college level. I want to give us one more example, and then I'm going to show you some of the tools I have to share. So one thing to really avoid, and I see this in writing a lot, is when summary stands for analysis. And there's a little bit of a difference between summarizing something, summarizing what we saw in the painting, versus analyzing what we saw in the painting. And I wanted to just give you an example of how that looks maybe for something that's written too. Here's an example of what a summary might look like. The Lottery by Shirley Jackson is about a town that comes together every year for a tradition. The townspeople draw a name, the person's name is drawn, whoever's name is drawn is killed by everyone else. Then there's a black box in this short story. It's used to hold slips of paper when the names of the town, with the names of the townspeople. It is old and splintered, and every year the townspeople talk about replacing the box, but no one wants to break tradition. So in summary, the question isn't, how does this text work? The question becomes, what's it about? Really, that's what it's asking. What's it about? And so this summary is telling us just what it's about. It doesn't really tell us too much about how it works. And so when we're doing literary analysis, our tools are going to look a little bit different than they did for analyzing art, right? So some of the tools might be thinking about characterization, plot, point of view. We're going to be thinking about all those sort of literary terms, right? And those are the terms that we can use to break down our story, for example. And so let's look back at that black box. This one's a little more particular of an observation. It's talking about an object in this short story. Here's an example of how someone might arrive at something that's more towards analysis. How does it work? The black box in the lottery is symbolic of death and of tradition. It is the color black, which is the color to represent death. It is old and splintery, and it holds the names of the townspeople, one of whom will be chosen to die. In addition, the text says, Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. The black box is symbolic and not just about death, but it also represents tradition and how some people want to change it, but can't overpower the majority who insist tradition remain. To quickly assess whether there's enough of your own original thought in your essay or paper, as opposed to information from your sources, here I have, for example, just a visualization of as you're producing analysis, as you're including direct quotations and evidence from your sources in the form of observations, maybe for text, it'll be quotations, right? If you're doing some research, you'll be gathering evidence as, sort of paraphrases or as direct quotations. Which of these do you think balances sources and synthesis together? The yellow being the sort of written by the writer, and the pink highlighted lines are purple. It looks more like purple to me. Quotes, paraphrases, summaries pulled from sources. If we're thinking about how our papers are going to be written, how do we sort of balance our analysis alongside our incorporation of secondary source material, of quotations, of evidence? Which one do you think looks like it's most representative of sort of a balance between the two, the sort of first square, the second one, or the third one? And so it would have to be one of these two. Now this one here is fine, but you'll see that the purple text, which is the summaries, paraphrases, and direct quotations, are actually more of the paper than the student's actual writing. And so ideally, you'll see in papers, you'll want to make sure to use fewer quotations. And so the yellow, which represents the student's words, this middle one would be probably the more ideal balance. You want to make sure every time you include some kind of observation about your text, source, song, media, that you have also a lot of explanation and analysis, right? We want to make sure that we're explaining what we're using and why we're making those observations. And so actually the middle one is probably a better balance. So if you have that visualization in your head as you're writing your own papers, as you're pulling together evidence, just continue to think about the impact of your voice. I think as a student, I always wanted to include more evidence, and so kind of hid myself behind a lot of that. But with analysis and synthesis, we really want to hear your voice. We really want you to feature your evidence, but then to come back to your voice and say, why did you choose that piece of evidence? And what does that have to do with your larger argument or synthesis? If you're writing in the sciences, um, perhaps more paraphrasing than direct quotations, but that sort of varies by discipline. And so I wanted to end with just thinking about, when are you asked to analyze and synthesize? I get to see a lot of really cool assignments as a writing specialist from all over the university. And so here's some of the things I've seen, and then I'm going to share some resources with you that I hope you pick and choose and keep with you for your own. Um, Students are asked to compare texts. How does one story or author speak to another? How does one character compare to another? AJ, how are specific video games similar or different, or characters in those video games similar or different? Sometimes students are asked to discuss readings. What does this particular word mean, or sentence or paragraph reveal about this character? A lot of students are also writing literature reviews. They're being asked to collect sources that talk about the same topic and to describe the conversation that those sources are taking part in. Analyze individual sources and then place them in conversation. That's really tricky. Um, Presenting your research findings. What does the evidence reveal that you've pulled together? And can you interpret what you found? Sometimes you're asked to argue for a certain theoretical approach, especially in social work, when you're gathering data for research. What therapy will work best for your client? I see this one a lot too. Can you describe why behavioral therapy is a better choice, for example? And so in thinking about all of these sort of important exercises, are also behind those exercises a consideration of ethics, right? We're really thinking about how close of a reader are you, how careful of a reader are you, and can you take that information and say something new with it? So for those of you who are in English or maybe literature or history, I don't know if poetic analysis comes to mind, but these are your tools. You have a toolbox for examining how your paper, how your genre works, and why does it work the way it does. So just think about these as different kinds of tools for analysis. If I were to describe a poem, for example, I'd have to know a lot about how to describe poetry. And so this is just, again, an example. But if you click on this link, it'll take you to a class I taught on poetry, and thinking about the different ways we talk about poetry with what voice is it written in, what kind of, is there a climax? Are there patterns, a specific tone that's evident in the poem? And so all of these kinds of words, rhythm, meter, stanzas are, of course, characteristic of poetic analysis. But maybe you're doing scholarly research writing and you aren't really sure how to do that or what exactly you need to analyze. I have a worksheet here for you. I've adapted from one of the classes at AU. It's just a note-taking template. And what it asks you to do is think about a rhetorical analysis, which is another kind of analysis, just thinking about the ways in which a particular research project was put together. So what were the methods and nature of the study? What were the results? What was the data? And these questions here push you towards analysis, not just reading through it to understand what it says, but then to ask questions of it. For those of you who have to write literature reviews, I also have a recommendation on how to gather information and analyze that information with a spreadsheet. And some of you might already do this, but one way to organize your data, especially if you're collecting lots of different sources, is to just create a nice table to keep them in order by placing the authors of the title or journal in one space, the year it was published in another, and to think about its constituent parts. Again, analysis. How does it work? Well, let's break it down into some different pieces. And so, of course, you can change how you break that down. But for literature review, it's helpful to have all of your sources in maybe one space so you can see challenges, so you can see connections, and you can see differences in studies, for example, if that's applicable to you. So these are just some of the kinds of resources. I included the analytical tools for observation. This one just works across any genre, just the basic tools for observation and for synthesis. So this last one, again, I would highly recommend just kind of keep it with you, print it out, practice it. After you practice it for a while, it will just sort of become part of you. But maybe you're working on a literature review or research, or maybe you're in English or poetry. Hopefully, some of these models give you an idea of how you can begin to analyze and where to take it from there. So thank you so much for your time. Maybe you can reflect on what assignments you're working on, for what class, what is the assignment. Thank you for joining me. I'll end with our last visualization of analysis and synthesis as something that's circular, something that you begin with, you end with, and that you continue to do back and forth. Another way of thinking about how we break those parts down. Thank you.